Imagine being trapped in the back of a commercial airplane, shoved into a cramped seat next to the bathroom, while your own sister sits in first class, loudly mocking your military uniform to hundreds of strangers. She looked right at me and screamed that I was a failure. She told the whole cabin that nobody in the real world would ever clap for me. She thought she had completely destroyed me. But what my sister didn't know was that I wasn't just playing soldier. I was a United States Air Force colonel returning from a classified rescue mission. And she certainly didn't expect the military to scramble two F-22 stealth fighter jets to intercept our commercial flight at 30,000 feet, just to silence her completely. This is a story about family betrayal and a stolen funeral. But more importantly, it shows that true power isn't about destroying those who hurt you. It's about having the incredible strength to heal them when their own lies crash down. If you believe in standing up for the truth, protecting your peace, and breaking toxic cycles, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of resilience. Tell us your own story in the comments below. Now, let's get into it. Have you ever looked at someone you share blood with and realized they do not see a sister, but rather a convenient target? I asked myself this very question as I sat in seat 12F, a cramped window seat shoved against the rear lavatory bulkhead of a commercial Boeing aircraft. The smell of harsh blue chemical disinfectant and stale coffee permeated the thin air. 40 feet ahead of me, basking in the spacious luxury of the first-class cabin, sat my older sister, Victoria. She wore a pristine cashmere wrap, oversized designer sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly styled hair, and a smile that did not reach her eyes. She made sure the entire cabin heard her when she twisted around in her plush leather seat, her gaze cutting down the aisle to find me in my simple civilian sweater, her voice, refined by years of recording lifestyle vlogs for her followers, sliced through the low hum of the engines. "Don't look so miserable, Kate," she called out, a venomous sweetness coating her words. "Just because you play soldier doesn't mean you're special. Out here in the real world, nobody is clapping for you." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend my honor. I simply sat there, clutching a worn, brown leather journal to my chest, letting the cool acrylic of the airplane window rest against my temple. What Victoria did not know, and what she refused to ever understand, was that I was not just playing soldier. I was a colonel in the United States Air Force. And I was returning home from a harrowing humanitarian mission that had cost me nearly everything, including the chance to say goodbye to the only man who truly understood me, our father. To understand how my sister and I ended up in this freezing, hostile cabin, you have to rewind to a month prior, in a region of Eastern Europe where the sky was perpetually choked with gray smoke and the ground shook with artillery fire. My unit had been deployed off the grid to secure a highly volatile extraction zone. Our mandate was not combat. It was preservation. We were tasked with the safe passage of 300 civilian refugees, mothers clutching infants, terrified elders, and children whose eyes had seen more horror than any human ever should. For 2 weeks, we operated in a complete communication blackout. I ate dust, slept in heavy ceramic body armor, and negotiated safe corridors through hostile territory. It was in the middle of a freezing night, just as we loaded the final transport truck, that my commanding officer handed me a secure satellite phone. The connection was static-laced and hollow. On the other end was a military chaplain back stateside. He delivered the words that brought me to my knees in the freezing mud. Arthur Hayes, my father, my compass, had suffered a massive, fatal heart attack. The grief was an immediate, crushing physical weight. My father had been a quiet, deeply principled man who taught me that true strength was defined by who you protected, not who you conquered. I wanted nothing more than to drop my gear, board the fastest transport jet, and rush home to see him one last time. But the reality of command is a heavy burden. I had 300 vulnerable souls relying on my clearance codes and tactical navigation to cross the border by sunrise. If I left, the convoy would stall, and lives would inevitably be lost. My father had raised me to value human life above all else. I knew exactly what he would have told me to do. I stayed. I guided the convoy across the border. And in doing so, I missed my father's funeral. Victoria did not hesitate to step into the void of my absence. While I was washing the grime and blood off my hands in a makeshift field hospital, my sister was orchestrating a highly publicized mourning period. She turned our father's quiet, dignified passing into a public relations spectacle for her failing lifestyle brand. Through friends back home, I saw the social media posts. Victoria standing by the casket in a sweeping black designer dress, dabbing at her dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. She hired a professional photographer to capture her raw grief. Worse than the spectacle was the narrative she spun to our extended family and her thousands of followers. In her tearful online videos, she painted herself as the devoted, heartbroken daughter holding the family together, and me, she branded me the cold, career-obsessed military woman who cared more about a paycheck and a promotion than her own father's grave. She stole his memory to feed her own vanity, turning my agonizing sacrifice into a weapon against me. In the war zones, I had learned the absolute sanctity of human life and the dignity every person deserves. It was a bitter, exhausting irony to realize that while I could protect the fundamental human rights of complete strangers in a foreign land, I was entirely powerless to protect my own father's memory from my sister's insatiable need for attention. The call came 3 weeks after the funeral. I was back in Washington, D.C., sitting in my sparse apartment, processing the heavy, suffocating silence of a world without my father. When Victoria's name flashed on my phone, my immediate instinct was to let it ring. Silence, however, rarely deters a woman who views every interaction as an audience engagement. I answered, keeping my voice neutral. Victoria sounded breathless, her tone adopting a practiced, fragile cadence. She told me the grief was becoming too much to bear alone. She said she needed to clear out Dad's house, to sort through his personal belongings and prepare the estate. And she begged me to help her. "We are all we have left. Katie," she whispered through the receiver. "I want to heal. I want us to be a family again. Please, let's fly down together. Clear the house. And make things right." A soldier is trained to recognize an ambush. And every instinct in my body warned me that this sudden olive branch was hollow. Yet, underneath the suspicion, there was a desperate, childish hope. She was my big sister. We had shared the same childhood, the same porch swings, the same father. I agreed to meet her at the airport, hoping against all logic that death had stripped away her pretenses and left behind the sister I used to know. Before the flight, we met at an upscale hotel near the airport where she had booked a suite for the night. She was supposedly packing up some last-minute PR packages. While she was in the shower, the reality of Victoria's life inadvertently shattered right in front of me. Her iPad, resting on the marble countertop, lit up with a series of aggressive push notifications. I didn't mean to pry, but the bold, capitalized words were impossible to ignore. The first was an email from a high-profile divorce attorney, threatening to withdraw counsel due to 60 days of unpaid legal fees. The second was a severe, automated alert from a major bank. Final notice of foreclosure primary residence. I stood there staring at the glowing screen. The truth hit me with a profound, sobering weight. Victoria was not the wildly successful, radiant influencer she projected to the world. She was drowning. Her marriage was a sham, her finances were in catastrophic ruin, and her brand was a fragile house of cards collapsing in the wind. Suddenly her cruelty made terrible sense. She didn't hate me because of my absence at the funeral. She resented me because my life, no matter how difficult, was built on solid truth, while hers was a desperate, exhausting fiction. The anger I had carried toward her began to dissolve, replaced by a heavy, aching pity. I realized then that my sister was fighting a war far more terrifying than the ones I had seen overseas. Because she was fighting it entirely alone behind a ring light, I chose to say nothing about the iPad. I wanted to give her the grace to come to me on her own terms. But that grace was quickly tested when we arrived at the airport terminal. Victoria handed me my boarding pass with a tragic, helpless sigh. She claimed there had been a terrible mix-up with the booking agency. She, of course, remained in seat 3C in first class, while I was relegated to 12F, the absolute last row of the aircraft, squashed against the vibrating wall of the lavatory. It was a calculated, physical manifestation of how she viewed our hierarchy. Worse still, as we walked down the jet bridge, I noticed the blinking red recording light on her phone, which was casually tucked into the breast pocket of her designer jacket. She was documenting this. She wanted to record my humiliation, hoping I would snap, hoping I would yell or cause a scene so she could post a viral vlog about surviving her toxic, aggressive sister. She was mining our family trauma for sympathy views to save her dying career. When she shouted her cruel remark at me from first class, mocking my uniform and telling me nobody was clapping for me, I felt the burning eyes of the other passengers turning my way. I sat down in 12F, the engine vibrations rattling my teeth, and opened the leather journal my father had left in his desk, which the estate lawyer had mailed to me days prior. I bypassed the daily logs and turned to the final page. There, in his steady, slanted cursive, was a message dated just 2 days before his heart failed. Katie, it read, I watch the news, and I know the danger you are in. Never doubt that your work saving those innocent lives is the proudest achievement of my life. Your sister is fighting a bitter war with herself. Be her peace. Katie, be stronger than her fear. Tears finally breached my defenses, silently spilling hot and fast down my cheeks. My father had known. He knew Victoria was lost, and he knew my heart was in the right place. I closed the journal, pressing the leather against my chest. I didn't need to destroy my sister with the secret of her bankruptcy. I had my father's blessing, and I had my truth. And I was about to find out that the United States Air Force had a truth of its own to share. The ambient noise of the commercial airliner, a steady, droning hum of engines and recycled air felt oppressive as I sat in the cramped confines of seat 12F. I held my father's leather journal in my lap, tracing the embossed lettering on the cover with my thumb. His final words to me, a quiet plea to be my sister's peace, echoed in my mind. I took a slow, measured breath, letting the anger that had calcified in my chest over the past month gently dissolve. I was a military commander trained to neutralize threats, but looking at the situation through my father's eyes, I finally understood that Victoria was not a threat. She was a casualty of her own desperate ambition, drowning in a shallow ocean of her own making. My moment of quiet reflection was interrupted by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of designer heels marching down the narrow aisle. I did not need to look up to know who was approaching. Victoria had left the spacious luxury of the first-class cabin, ostensibly to use the rear lavatory, but I knew her true objective. Silence is a narcissist's greatest fear. My refusal to react to her earlier public humiliation had deprived her of the dramatic confrontation she needed for her hidden camera. She needed a villain for her narrative, and my stoicism was ruining her script. She stopped directly beside my row, bracing her hand against the overhead bin, up close, without the softening effect of distance and good lighting. The cracks in her pristine facade were glaringly obvious. Her makeup was applied with a heavy hand to mask the dark circles under her eyes, and there was a frantic, brittle energy vibrating beneath her skin. She glanced down at my scuffed tactical duffel bag, shoved under the seat in front of me, a sneer twisting her glossed lips. Still carrying that hideous bag. Kate, she whispered, ensuring her voice was just loud enough for the neighboring passengers to hear. I thought the military paid officers enough to at least afford decent luggage. Or are you just determined to play the tragic, underappreciated martyr today? I looked up at her, maintaining absolute composure. I noticed the slight bulge in her jacket pocket, the unmistakable outline of her smartphone with the camera lens positioned perfectly to capture my reaction. She was baiting me, waiting for the angry outburst she could weaponize. instead of giving her the ammunition she desperately craved. I looked at her with profound, unapologetic pity. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, watching her confident smirk begin to falter under the weight of my steady gaze. "I know about the foreclosure, Vic," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, laced with a gentle sorrow rather than malice. "I saw the email from your divorce attorney at the hotel. I know you haven't paid them in 60 days. The blood drained from Victoria's face so rapidly it was as if she had been struck by a physical blow. Her eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror, the armor of her arrogance completely shattered, exposing the terrified, bankrupt woman hiding beneath the designer labels. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "You don't have to pretend with me," I continued softly, leaning forward slightly. "You don't have to perform. You don't have to record this for sympathy views to save a brand that is already gone. I am not your enemy, you are my sister. And regardless of what you said about me at the funeral, I just want you to be okay. Let me help you." For a fraction of a second, I saw the real Victoria, the vulnerable older sister I used to ride bikes with, the girl who used to braid my hair. I saw the crushing weight of her exhaustion, but the addiction to her false reality was too strong. Admitting defeat meant confronting the absolute emptiness of her life. Panic seized her features. She took a step back, her chest heaving as she scrambled to rebuild her shattered defenses. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me, her voice breaking into a hysterical, defensive screech that startled the entire back half of the plane. "Shut up, you don't know anything," she screamed, abandoning all pretense of her refined influencer persona. "You think you are so much better than everyone because you wear that uniform. You are not special. Kate, do you hear me? Nobody is clapping for you. Nobody cares." She didn't wait for a response. She spun around on her heel and practically fled up the aisle, retreating to the safety of her first-class fortress. The passengers around me stared in shocked silence, but I simply closed my eyes and leaned back against my seat. I had planted the seed of truth, and I knew the harvest would be painful, but I could not have predicted that the universe, and the United States Air Force, had orchestrated their own profound method of delivering that truth. A few moments later, the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted. It did not begin as a sound, but as a deep, structural tremor that vibrated through the floorboards. The tremor quickly escalated from a subtle vibration into a dominant, mechanical roar that drowned out the commercial plane's engines. Plastic tray tables rattled violently in their housings. A flight attendant working the beverage cart froze in the aisle, gripping the handles as overhead bins began to shake. Panic, hot and immediate, flared across the cabin. Passengers gripped their armrests with white knuckles, some pressing their faces against the windows to search the cloudy sky for the source of the terrifying noise. From my vantage point in the back, I could see Victoria in seat 3C. She had leaped out of her seat, clutching the headrest in front of her, her face a mask of absolute terror. The woman who had just mocked my military service was now whimpering helplessly. Realizing that her wealth and social media followers meant absolutely nothing when real danger approached, I did not panic. My ears, trained on active flight lines across the globe, instantly recognized the acoustic signature tearing through the thin atmosphere. It was the distinct, earth-shattering harmonic of thrust-vectoring turbofan engines, F-119s to be exact. Suddenly, the dense white clouds outside my window shredded apart. A massive, geometric slab of radar-absorbent gray metal sliced into my field of vision. It was a United States Air Force F-22 Raptor stealth fighter, flying so incredibly close I could count the rivets on its fuselage. A split second later, a second Raptor appeared on the opposite side of the aircraft, boxing our commercial Boeing into a tight, aggressive, and highly illegal civilian airspace formation. The cabin erupted into chaos. People were shouting, pointing, and praying. Victoria was screaming something toward the cockpit door, convinced we were under attack. Then the aircraft intercom hissed to life. The sharp electronics donk squeal instantly silenced the screaming cabin. The captain's voice filled this. He did not use his standard, soothing customer service tone. His voice was taut, vibrating with a rigid, absolute reverence. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and do not be alarmed, the captain announced, his words carrying a heavy, undeniable weight. The two F-22 fighter jets outside our windows are not a threat. We are being escorted into Washington, D.C. airspace by an official Air Force honor guard. They have been ordered to close this airspace to salute a very special passenger sitting with us today in seat 12F. The entire cabin went dead silent. It was a physical, heavy silence. Every single head on the aircraft swiveled toward the back row. Colonel Catherine Hayes. The captain continued, his voice echoing through the stunned cabin. Over the past month, while operating in a highly hostile conflict zone, Colonel Hayes orchestrated the safe extraction and survival of 300 civilian refugees. For her unwavering service to human rights, global peace, and the preservation of innocent life, the United States military has ordered this escort to welcome her home. Colonel, on behalf of this flight crew and a grateful nation, thank you for your profound sacrifice. Outside the windows, the two F-22 Raptors simultaneously dropped their left wings, performing a sharp, aggressive roll, the supreme military aviation salute reserved for the highest honors. Inside the cabin, a gray-haired man 2 ahead of me slowly stood up and began to clap. He was followed by a woman across the aisle, then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire aircraft erupted into a deafening, tearful standing ovation. They were not just clapping for a soldier. They were clapping for humanity. Up in first class, Victoria's knees finally buckled. She collapsed into her plush leather seat, burying her face in her hands. Her entire empire of lies had burned to ash at 30,000 feet. The woman she had banished to the bathroom, the sister she had relentlessly humiliated, was a national hero. She was drowning in the applause she had explicitly told me I would never receive. When the aircraft finally touched down and taxied to the gate, not a single passenger stood to collect their bags. They waited, creating a clear, open aisle from row 12 to the forward exit. I picked up my duffel bag and walked forward, accepting the nods and quiet words of respect from the strangers I passed. When I reached row 3, I stopped. Victoria was sitting there, her makeup ruined by tears. Trembling like a frightened child, she shrank back into her seat, bracing herself for the cruel remark. The final devastating blow she was certain I was about to deliver. I looked at her, remembering the terrified refugees I had pulled from the mud. I remembered my father's journal. I did not see a monster. I saw a broken human being who desperately needed a lifeline. I set my bag down, reached out, and offered her my hand. Dad loved us both. Vic, I said softly, my voice cutting through her shame. Your war is over. Let's go home. Victoria stared at my outstretched hand, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her cheeks. The armor cracked, and the terrified sister underneath finally surrendered. She reached out, grasping my hand tightly, and collapsed against my shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably into my coat. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet respect of the cabin, the toxic cycle was broken. True strength was never about dropping bombs or proving dominance. It was about having the grace to look at someone who tried to break you and choosing to heal them instead. The walk through the airport terminal was a stark reversal of the journey we had taken just hours prior. When we had boarded the flight, Victoria had marched ahead of me like royalty, her chin raised, demanding the attention and envy of every stranger she passed, while I trailed behind like an unwanted shadow. Now the dynamic had completely shattered. As we emerged from the jet bridge, passengers from our flight were lingering near the gate, waiting to catch another glimpse of the woman the Air Force had stopped the sky to honor. A few people raised their hands in quiet salutes. Others simply smiled with deep respect. Victoria shrank away from their gazes, utterly humiliated, trying to hide her tear-streaked face behind the collar of her ruined cashmere coat. She expected me to bask in the glory, to parade her defeat in front of the crowd. Instead, I placed my arm firmly around her trembling shoulders, shielding her from the onlookers, and guided her swiftly toward the private exit. I was not interested in public validation. I was only interested in getting my sister to a safe harbor. The rental car smelled of artificial pine and stale upholstery, a sharp contrast to the familiar, comforting scent of our childhood that we were driving toward. The journey from the airport to our father's house in the quiet suburbs of Washington, D.C. was cloaked in a heavy, fragile silence. The adrenaline that had spiked during the flight was finally beginning to ebb, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion in my bones. I kept my eyes on the wet asphalt, the windshield wipers maintaining a rhythmic, hypnotic beat against a sudden afternoon drizzle. I occasionally glanced over at the passenger seat. Victoria was curled into herself, staring blankly out the rain-streaked window. She looked smaller than she had in decades, stripped of her arrogant facade, her defensive posturing, and her designer armor. She was just Vic again, the older sister who used to sneak into my room during thunderstorms because she was terrified of the lightning. The woman who had tried to destroy me was gone, washed away by the magnitude of the grace she had been shown. When I finally turned the key in the lock of our father's front door, the familiar scent of old oak, lemon pledge, and his signature cherry pipe tobacco rushed out to greet us. The house was exactly as he had left it. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked with a steady, reassuring heartbeat. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through the living room curtains. The absolute stillness of the house magnified the reality of his absence, and for a moment, the grief threatened to pull me under. But I felt Victoria's hand nervously grip the sleeve of my uniform. She was standing in the foyer, trembling violently, looking at the framed photographs on the mantel. There we were, two little girls with gap-toothed smiles, standing on either side of a man who had loved us with an infinite, unconditional capacity. The contrast between the innocence in those frames and the bitter warfare of the past month was too much for her to bear. She collapsed onto the floral sofa, pulling her knees to her chest, and the floodgates finally opened. The confession poured out of her in ragged, agonizing waves. She told me about the crushing, suffocating pressure of trying to maintain an illusion of perfection for millions of strangers on the internet. She wept as she admitted that her husband, Lyall, had already emptied their joint accounts and filed the divorce papers weeks ago. She spoke of the foreclosure, the mounting lawsuits from unpaid vendors, and the terrifying realization that her entire identity was tied to a brand that was completely bankrupt. "I was so angry at you, Kate," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "You are so strong, so grounded. You save lives. You do things that actually matter. And I sell overpriced skin cream to people who don't even know my real name. When Dad died, I panicked. I needed to feel important. I needed to feel like I was the good daughter, the successful one. Because if I wasn't that, then I was absolutely nothing. I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry." I sat down next to her, the springs of the old sofa creaking softly beneath us. I didn't offer her hollow platitudes. I didn't tell her that everything was going to magically be okay, because the reality was that she was about to face a brutal, public reckoning with her finances and her career. But I did exactly what my training and my father had taught me to do in the aftermath of a devastating collapse. I secured the perimeter, and I offered a lifeline. I reached out and pulled my sister into my arms, holding her tightly as she cried until her voice gave out. "You don't need millions of people to clap for you to be worthy of love. Vic," I whispered into her messy hair, rocking her gently. "You never had to be perfect. You just had to be you. And you are not nothing. You are my sister. We are going to fix this. Not the brand, not the influencer, but you. We are going to fix you." In the quiet sanctuary of our father's living room, the war officially ended, and the long, painful work of rebuilding finally began. The following weeks were a grueling but necessary purgatory. We cleared out our father's house not as bitter rivals fighting over an inheritance, but as sisters honoring a legacy. We packed his clothes into donation boxes, sorted through his vast library of history books, and cried together over the small, sentimental trinkets he had kept hidden in his desk drawers. On the third night, while we were sitting on the floor of his study, surrounded by boxes, I handed Victoria the brown leather journal. I watched her read his final entry, watched her trace his slanted handwriting as he wrote that he knew she was lost, but that he loved her anyway. It was the absolute closure she desperately needed. It was the permission to stop running from her failures. The next morning, Victoria officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. She deactivated her social media accounts, cutting off the toxic supply of external validation that had poisoned her for years. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, stepping out of the spotlight and into a very harsh, very quiet reality. But for the first time in a decade, she looked genuinely peaceful. She looked free. As I sit here today, recording this video for all of you, my sister is living in a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. She works as a floor manager at a local botanical nursery, getting her hands dirty in actual soil instead of pretending to farm organic ingredients for a camera. She is learning how to be a regular, flawed, beautiful human being. And we talk on the phone every single Sunday. We live in a society that constantly tells us to cut off anyone who hurts us, to completely destroy our enemies, and to seek ruthless vengeance against those who wrong us, even if they share our blood. We are told that forgiveness is a weakness, that empathy is a liability, and that we must protect our own peace at the expense of everyone else's dignity. But I learned in the war zones, pulling desperate, terrified refugees from the rubble of their homes, that true equality and fundamental human rights begin in our own living rooms. My sister was drowning in a culture that valued her only for her aesthetic, her wealth, and her superficial status. When those things crumbled, she turned into a monster out of sheer survival instinct. I could have destroyed her on that airplane. I had the intelligence dossier, the proof of her bankruptcy, and the moral high ground. I could have delivered a crushing, humiliating blow that would have left her with absolutely nothing. But sometimes the most powerful weapon you possess is not an F-22 Raptor, and it is not a devastating comeback. The most powerful weapon you have is the grace to look at someone who is desperately trying to break you and realize that they are already broken. Healing does not come from proving you are superior to someone else. It comes from recognizing our shared humanity and proving that we are all, regardless of our worst mistakes, worthy of a second chance. If you have ever felt minimized by your own family, if you have ever been the target of a toxic sibling's insecurity, or if you have ever had to be the bigger person in a dynamic designed to make you feel incredibly small, I want you to hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel to join a community of women who believe in actual strength, authentic vulnerability, and radical, life-changing healing. I want to hear your stories in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a moment where choosing radical forgiveness, rather than bitter vengeance, completely changed the trajectory of your life? Please share it with us, because I read every single one. And your story might be the exact lifeline another woman needs to hear today to finally break her own toxic cycle. But I must leave you with a word of warning. Forgiveness is a beautiful, powerful tool, but it is not the same thing as allowing yourself to be perpetually abused. There is a very distinct line between offering grace to someone who is hurting and allowing a toxic system to silence the truth. In my next video, I am going to tell you a very different kind of story. I will tell you about the line I had to draw when a high-ranking commanding officer tried to systematically silence a female whistleblower on my base. You will not believe the lengths they went to in order to cover up the scandal, and what happened when the undeniable truth finally broke through the chain of command. Make sure your notification bell is turned on, because you will not want to miss how that battle ended. Thank you for listening. Stay strong, and I will see you next time. Welcome back. If you are new here, my name is Kate, and in my last video, I shared the deeply personal story of how my sister and I navigated a devastating family crisis that culminated at 30,000 feet. We talked about radical forgiveness and the incredible strength it takes to heal rather than destroy. But as I warned you at the end of that video, grace and forgiveness do not mean turning a blind eye to active malice. There is a distinct, immutable line between showing compassion to a broken family member and allowing a toxic, oppressive system to crush an innocent person. Today, I am going to take you back 3 years to a heavily fortified Allied military base in Western Europe, where I learned exactly what happens when the people who are sworn to protect us become the very monsters we are fighting against. It is a story about the insidious nature of unchecked power, the courage of a single female whistleblower, and the absolute necessity of standing up for what is right, even when the entire hierarchy is designed to keep you silent. At the time, I was stationed as the deputy commander of a massive logistical hub responsible for routing billions of dollars in humanitarian aid and military supplies to conflict zones across the globe. It was a high-stakes, high-pressure environment governed by a rigid chain of command. Sitting at the very top of that chain was General Thomas Sterling. To the public and the press, General Sterling was a decorated, unimpeachable war hero with a chest full of medals and a perfectly pressed uniform. He was charming, commanding, and projected an aura of absolute authority. But behind the closed doors of the command center, he ran the base like a tyrannical boys' club. He was a man who demanded absolute loyalty over absolute integrity, and he had a well-known reputation for swiftly ending the careers of anyone who dared to question his methods, particularly officers who refused to smile and stay in their designated lanes. The heart of this story belongs to Captain Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was a brilliant, meticulous logistics officer. She was the kind of woman who arrived at her desk 2 hours before the sun came up and stayed long after the overhead lights buzzed off. She possessed an analytical mind that could spot a single missing crate in a manifest of 10,000 items. She was deeply committed to her work because she understood that the numbers on her spreadsheets represented actual human lives blankets for freezing refugees, medical supplies for field hospitals, and clean water for devastated communities. One evening in late November, while auditing a massive shipment of medical trauma kits meant for a civilian relief camp, Sarah noted a terrifying discrepancy. Millions of dollars worth of life-saving medical supplies were systematically being marked as damaged in transit and diverted from the supply chain. Sarah did exactly what a person of high moral character is trained to do. She compiled a comprehensive, bulletproof report documenting the missing shipments, the altered digital signatures, and the fabricated routing numbers. Believing in the integrity of the system, she bypassed her immediate supervisor and took the file directly to General Sterling's office, expecting him to launch an immediate investigation. Instead, she walked into an ambush. General Sterling did not praise her diligence. He locked his office door, threw her report into his paper shredder, and unleashed a terrifying campaign of psychological intimidation. He told Sarah she was hysterical, overworked, and confused. When she refused to back down, he threatened to ruin her life. He informed her that if she breathed a word of her delusions to anyone, he would have her court-martialed for insubordination, strip her of her rank, and ensure she left the military with a dishonorable discharge that would permanently destroy her civilian future. That night, long after the base had gone to sleep, there was a quiet, desperate knock on the door of my officer's quarters. I opened it to find Captain Jenkins standing in the freezing rain, trembling so violently she could barely speak. She wasn't just crying. She was completely shattered by the realization that the institution she had dedicated her life to was actively protecting a predator. She stepped inside my quarters, reached into the pocket of her soaked uniform, and handed me a duplicate flash drive containing every piece of evidence Sterling thought he had destroyed. As we sat at my small kitchen table, drinking black coffee while she recounted Sterling's threats, a cold, calculated fury settled into my chest. General Sterling was not just stealing supplies. He was stealing the fundamental human right to survival from innocent refugees to line his own pockets on the black market. And he was using his patriarchal authority to crush a brilliant woman who dared to expose him. I looked Sarah in the eyes and made her a promise. I told her she was no longer fighting alone, and that I was going to help her burn General Sterling's corrupt empire to the ground. For the next 3 weeks, I operated in the shadows. I knew that taking Sarah's evidence through the standard chain of command on the base would be a fatal mistake, as Sterling had loyalists positioned at every checkpoint. If I was going to take down a 2-star general, I could not just wound him. I had to utterly dismantle him with undeniable, irrefutable proof that extended beyond the base's jurisdiction. I leveraged my background in joint special operations and quietly reached out to a trusted network of forensic accountants and intelligence operatives back at the Pentagon, working strictly on encrypted, off-network servers late into the night. We followed the digital breadcrumbs Sarah had uncovered. It did not take long to trace the diverted medical supplies to a sophisticated black market syndicate operating out of Eastern Europe. More importantly, we traced the massive, untraceable wire transfers from that syndicate directly into a series of offshore shell companies registered under the maiden name of General Sterling's wife. Sterling, however, was not entirely oblivious. He sensed a shift in the atmosphere. He knew Sarah had not completely surrendered, and he correctly suspected that I was providing her with a shield. One afternoon, he summoned me to his expansive office. He poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon, leaned back in his leather chair, and attempted to play the patronizing mentor. He told me I was a rising star in the Air Force, and that it would be a profound tragedy if I ruined my impeccable career by associating with a troubled, unstable subordinate like Captain Jenkins. It was a classic, transparent power play designed to isolate women from one another. He wanted me to choose my own ambition over my integrity. I sat perfectly still, my expression completely unreadable, and politely thanked him for his concern before walking out of his office. I did not flinch, because I knew something he did not. The trap was already set, and the jaws were about to snap shut, believing he still held absolute control. Sterling orchestrated a formal disciplinary board hearing aimed at terminating Captain Jenkins' career. He intended to charge her with falsifying documents and insubordination, making a public spectacle of her to ensure no one else would ever dare question his authority. To legitimize the execution, he invited a senior inspector general from the Pentagon to oversee the proceedings. When the day of the hearing arrived, the briefing room was packed with Sterling's loyal officers. Sarah sat at the defense table, pale but resolute, while Sterling stood at the podium, confidently spinning his web of lies to the inspector general. He painted Sarah as a paranoid, vindictive woman who could not handle the stress of military logistics. He demanded her immediate dismissal. When it was time for the defense to speak, I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I bypassed the microphone, walked directly to the digital projector, and plugged in an encrypted hard drive. I did not defend Sarah's character, because the truth requires no defense. Instead, I projected the offshore bank records, the wire transfers, the black market shipping manifests, and the encrypted emails directly onto the massive screen behind General Sterling. The room collectively stopped breathing. I systematically walked the Inspector General through every single document, narrating the exact methodology Sterling had used to steal millions of dollars in life-saving refugee aid, and proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that he had weaponized his rank to silence the woman who caught him. The color drained from General Sterling's face, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified old man. His pristine uniform suddenly seemed miles too big for him. The Inspector General did not ask a single question. He immediately suspended Sterling of his command, ordered military police to take him into custody, and initiated a full federal investigation that eventually sent Thomas Sterling to federal prison for 20 years. Captain Sarah Jenkins was fully exonerated, publicly commended for her extraordinary bravery, and promoted to major within the year. The lesson here is vital. True leadership and true power have absolutely nothing to do with the stars on your shoulder, the title on your door, or your ability to intimidate those beneath you. True power is the courage to stand between a predator and their prey. It is the unwavering commitment to protect the vulnerable, to champion equality, and to ensure that the truth is never silenced by the heavy hand of corruption. When we stand together, when we refuse to let the patriarchal systems divide us with fear and intimidation, we are unstoppable. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in fighting for integrity and protect the whistleblowers of the world, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had to stand up to a corrupt boss or an abusive authority figure. Until next time, keep your head high, protect your peace, and never be afraid to speak your truth. The immediate aftermath of General Thomas Sterling's arrest was not marked by triumphant cheering or celebratory parades. Instead, a heavy, complicated silence descended over the Allied military base. When you tear down a cornerstone of an institution, even a deeply corrupt one, the entire structure trembles. For several weeks, I navigated a tense and deeply polarized environment. There were officers who quietly offered me nods of profound gratitude in the hallways, recognizing that a massive shadow had finally been lifted from the command center. But there were also those who looked at me with cold suspicion. Loyalists who believed that protecting the shield was more important than protecting the truth. It is a harsh reality of leadership that doing the right thing is rarely the popular choice. The isolation that followed the tribunal was absolute and physically exhausting. I spent my evenings alone in my quarters. The adrenaline of the fight completely drained from my system, leaving behind a hollow fatigue. I questioned if the toll on my own peace of mind was worth the battle. A doubt that creeps into the mind of every person who has ever dared to stand up to a towering giant. It was during one of these intensely lonely evenings, while the European winter howled outside my window, that a small, battered cardboard box arrived in the base mailroom. The return address was written in a familiar, slightly messy handwriting that I had not seen on a package in over a decade. It was from my sister, Victoria, in the past, if Victoria sent anything at all. It was an impersonal PR box filled with her company's leftover wellness products, mailed by an assistant and completely devoid of any real affection. But this box was different. I cut the packing tape with my pocket knife and opened the flaps. Inside, there were no expensive cashmere scarves or luxury skin creams. Instead, sitting on a bed of crumpled newspaper, were 3 bags of cheap instant coffee, a pair of thick wool socks, and a small, folded piece of lined paper. My breath caught in my throat. It was an exact replica of the care packages our father used to send me every time I was deployed in a blackout zone. With trembling hands, I unfolded the piece of paper. The message was short, written in blue ink. I know I can never replace him. And I know I have a lifetime of making up to do. But I want to try. Still proud of you, Katie Love. Vic, I sat on the edge of my military cot, clutching that piece of paper and wept. The tears were not born of sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming relief. The sister I had lost to the toxic machinery of social media and hollow ambition had actually returned. The radical forgiveness I had offered her in the darkest moment of her life had not been wasted. It had taken root, and it was blooming. I picked up my encrypted phone and dialed her number. When she answered, her voice was not the polished, breathless tone of the influencer she used to be. It was tired, grounded, and incredibly real. We talked for over 2 hours that night. She told me about the grueling reality of her bankruptcy, the humiliating meetings with lawyers, and the physical exhaustion of working on her feet all day at the botanical nursery. But she also told me about the quiet peace she felt when she locked the door of her small apartment at night, knowing that she didn't owe anyone a performance. I told her about the terrifying battle with General Sterling, the isolation of blowing the whistle, and the exhaustion of carrying the weight of the uniform. For the first time in our adult lives, we were not competing. We were not performing. We were just two sisters, sitting in the trenches of our respective lives, holding space for each other's pain. We realized that night that we had both been fighting against massive, toxic systems. Hers was an industry that demanded absolute perfection at the cost of her soul, and mine was a patriarchal hierarchy that demanded absolute silence at the cost of human lives. Dismantling those systems required the exact same kind of courage. 1 year later, the harsh European winter had faded into a crisp, golden American autumn. I stood on a gentle grassy hill in a quiet cemetery just outside of Washington, D.C., the fallen amber leaves crunching softly beneath my boots. I was not in my dress uniform. I wore a simple civilian trench coat. The military medals and silver eagles left locked in a drawer back at the Pentagon. Beside me stood Victoria. She was wearing a faded denim jacket, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, completely devoid of the heavy contour makeup that used to function as her daily armor. There were no cameras here today. There were no lifestyle journalists, no ring lights, and no audiences. We were just two daughters standing before a simple granite headstone that read, Arthur Hayes, a father who loved immeasurably. It was the 1 year anniversary of the day his heart had failed, the day our family had completely shattered, and ultimately, the day our long journey toward healing had truly begun. Victoria knelt in the damp grass and placed a small, vibrant potted fern at the base of the headstone. She had grown it herself from a single cutting at the nursery, nurturing it with her own bruised hands over the past 6 months. She rested her hand on the cold stone and closed her eyes. I watched a single, genuine tear trace its way down her cheek, completely different from the theatrical sobbing she had performed for her followers a year ago. This grief was quiet, sacred, and profoundly beautiful. "We made it, Dad," she whispered, her voice carrying a steady strength that I had never heard before. I finally stopped running, and Katie brought me home. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the small, heavy deployment coin I had carried with me through the war zones, the mud, and the terrifying tribunal. I placed it gently next to the fern, a silent promise to the man who had taught me that the greatest battles we fight are never for territory, but for the preservation of human dignity. We stood shoulder to shoulder in the autumn wind, the toxic war of our past completely surrendered to the earth. As I look back on everything that transpired, from the screaming match on that Boeing aircraft to the earth-shattering roar of the F-22 Raptors, from the collapse of a fake empire to the dismantling of a corrupt general, I realize that the universe has a remarkable way of forcing us to face the absolute truth. We are conditioned by society to believe that power is defined by dominance, wealth, and the ability to silence those who oppose us. We are taught to cut ties, burn bridges, and leave the broken pieces behind. But true power is the exact opposite. True power is the vulnerability it takes to look at your sister, who has humiliated you in front of the world, and offer her your hand instead of your wrath. True power is the courage to stand in front of a room full of superiors and demand justice for the innocent, even when your own career is on the line. To every woman watching this right now, I want you to remember this. You do not need an audience to be special. You do not need a flawless aesthetic to be worthy of love. And you certainly do not need a military uniform to be a warrior. Your strength lies in your capacity for radical compassion, your unwavering commitment to your own integrity, and your absolute refusal to let the toxic systems of this world turn your heart to stone. You have the right to demand respect, the right to protect your peace, and the sacred obligation to lift up the women around you who are drowning in the dark. Thank you for walking this incredible, painful, and beautiful journey with me. Thank you for creating a space where we can share our scars without shame. If you found a piece of your own story in mine, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with the women in your life who need to be reminded of their own immense power. The world can be a dark and terrifying place, but as long as we refuse to let go of each other's hands, there is no storm we cannot weather. Stay fiercely kind, guard your truth, And I will see you all in the next chapter. As we reach the end of this journey, I want you to take a moment to reflect on the true meaning of strength. We live in a society that constantly tells us that when someone wrongs us, especially a toxic family member, our ultimate goal should be ruthless revenge. We are conditioned to believe that the only way to win is to humiliate them the exact same way they humiliated us. When those two F-22 Raptors dipped their wings outside that airplane window, and the entire cabin stood up to applaud, it would have been so incredibly easy for Kate to look at her shattered, bankrupt sister and deliver a final, crushing blow. Victoria had stolen their father's funeral and tried to turn Kate into a public villain. But Kate realized something profound. Victoria was already destroying herself. True power is the immense, quiet vulnerability it takes to look at the person who tried to break you, recognize the desperate brokenness hiding behind their malice, and offer them a lifeline instead of a weapon. Kate proved that you do not need to surrender your boundaries to show compassion. She held her ground, let the absolute truth speak for itself, and broke a toxic cycle of jealousy with one simple act of grace. She taught us that healing doesn't come from proving you are superior. It comes from recognizing our shared humanity. Whether you are dealing with a narcissistic sibling fighting for hollow validation, or a corrupt authority figure trying to silence the truth, remember that your integrity is your absolute greatest armor. You do not need a military uniform to be a warrior, and you certainly do not need an audience to be worthy of respect. Your value is inherent. Protect your peace. Stand fiercely for the truth. And always remember that lifting someone out of the dark will always be more powerful than burying them in it. This content has been researched, developed, and edited manually by us to deliver meaningful lessons.